Hello folks, it's Gareth here. Welcome along to the Somewhere on Earth podcast for Tuesday the 17th of September 2024. And we have voices from, let me just kind of scroll down, somebody's from London here and somebody from Bristol, but who was speaking to us from somewhere that wasn't Bristol. But so there we are, so people from different places and us in the studio. What an intro that was, here we go. And with us today is the excellent Peter Guest, very much here in our studio in London and thriving, but only just, I think it's fair to say. A bit tired maybe, or not too bad?
And also kind of all over the place like your introduction. So.
You cannot be as all over the place as that introduction was. I'm amazed they kept it, but I think they're just so desperate just to crack on with the rest of it, they'll make do with that. So let's hope. All right, here we go. It gets better, folks. I'm really selling it, aren't I? Yeah, it's going to be a brilliant one today. Here we go. And coming up today, the Chinese electric vehicles that stop working when the companies that develop them go bust. What on earth is going on? I mean, when you buy a car, you kind of expect it to keep going despite what happens to the manufacturer, right? Well, that might have been the case back in the day. Is it necessarily the case these days? We have a cautionary tale for you. Also in this edition, a pen that reads Braille. Yes, indeed, you just press it onto the dimples and you trace it across the Braille, and that is converted to text. And of course, once it's text, it can then be potentially converted into audio or just about anything else. So, really clever piece of technology. We'll tell you all about it right here on the Somewhere on Earth podcast. Now, when Pontiac cars were discontinued after hitting financial problems in the late 2000s, the cars still operated absolutely fine. I mean, they were cars, people drove them out of the showroom, no worries at all, despite the brand having been discontinued. Well, you'd expect the same, really, when any car maker goes bust. You'd hope so, wouldn't you? Bye-bye company, but hey, I still have one of your cars. But not so with some Chinese EVs that seem to stop working, or certainly bits stop working when the company that made them, when that company goes bust. You don't have support anymore. What happens when you have software problems? It's a bit of a nightmare. So Pete, you're quite interested in all this. Can you just explain to maybe some of our puzzled and potentially worried listeners what might be going on? You know, they buy an EV and perhaps it's not all that good.
So I think the main story here we're talking about is about WM Motor, which is an EV company based in China. And like a lot of EVs, it is a melding of hardware and software, right? The car itself is obviously mechanical and batteries, but everything from the air conditioning, the locks, the ignition is electronic, and it's also often served through an app. Now, in this particular case, users suddenly found themselves unable to use their cars because there was a server problem and they could no longer access the basic things like the dashboard. This is obviously just one example of it, but it's becoming an increasingly common problem. We've seen it with lots of different electrical vehicle brands, Tesla, people struggling to get in and out of their cars when something has gone wrong with the software. Other companies, the Swedish company Fisker has had some problems with it. And, software problems, some of them remote, some of them direct to the vehicle, are becoming real problems, all the way down to the brakes suddenly stopping working when the software's gone wrong.
A bit scary. I suppose at least with something like Tesla, the firm is still going, so you can get some support. But some of these other companies we've been talking about, the company goes out of business, and then who do you call when your brakes don't work anymore, or when the car starts doing something weird?
Well, it's a problem for, obviously, companies that have gone out of business, but it's also sometimes a problem for companies that are still in business, because you need to find someone who's able to service the vehicle that you've got and deal with the problem that you've got. Now, in the old days, a mechanic could probably figure out how to fix almost any vehicle that he had in front of him or she had in front of her, right? It's a basic set of mechanical problems. Suddenly you need a software engineer with access to the API, the back end of the software that runs the vehicle to be able to do it. Now, you might be able to get that in your city, but if you're a long way away from that, who do you call?
Yeah, who do you call? A brief digression, but I'm sure listeners will sympathise with this, whether you're a biker or not. But as I've just bought It's a used motorcycle, but to me, it's a new motorcycle. Absolutely love it. Just took it out for a bit of a spin. Everything's going really well with this motorbike. It's a modern motorcycle, so there's lots of electronics on it. Then over the weekend, I disconnected the battery to add some little toys to it, like an automatic chain oiler and all this kind of stuff that bikers will know about and will probably bore everybody else to tears. But anyway, reconnected the battery, and then I got the service warning light coming up on the instrument panel of the motorcycle. And, and the bike doesn't need servicing, but for some reason, me disconnecting the battery made the bike think it was back to the year 2000. So the bike suddenly thought it was 24 years old. And the only way I can get that little service light off is to take it back to the dealer so somebody can just plug a laptop into the OBD port and reset the bike. Or I can just get some device off eBay and just do it myself. But I'm just worried I might mess it up and completely mess the bike up. So I don't know. So that's about motorbiking. And this might seem like a digression, but it just ties into that whole thing now. There's basically, when you ride a motorcycle or you're driving a modern car, and especially an EV car, effectively you're driving a computer, aren't you? And everything's fine when the software's all right. When it isn't, you can have a few issues. But anyway, enough of me and my motorbikes and all that. Why don't we hear from a London-based car owner who's been talking to Anya? He doesn't want us to name him, but, he has his own tale of woe. Here he is.
So the car is called a Fisker Ocean Extreme. I procured it in just before Christmas. The reason I went with the Fisker over any other car was because of its green credentials. The car is actually made from recycled, disused cargo nets, fishing nets that's reclaimed from the sea, and disused plastics and that. There's no car like it at all in some of the features that it has. A solar sunroof, which was retractable, California mode where all the windows come down. It was a good sell, put it that way. It was a good sell, and it's a sustainable car, so it ticked all the boxes as far as I'm concerned.
But you didn't arrive today for this interview in the car, did you? You came by bike. You've had some problems with that car, haven't you? Tell me about those.
Most of the problems I've had are to do with either the software and some of the software features, or the software that controls the hardware.
But why can't the company just update those then?
Some issues have been corrected via the over-the-air updates.
But you now have a problem with these updates and with your app because the company
It's gone bankrupt.
It's gone bankrupt, hasn't it?
Yeah, they filed for chapter, what they call in the States, chapter 11. We're going to make sure we understand the makeup of the company. The car is actually produced in Austria by a company called Magna Steyr, but the company is actually registered in California. So it's an American company, but the car is actually manufactured in Austria. Now, Magna Steyr, they produce cars like the Aston Martin, BMW. So quality-wise, the build quality of the car is very good. Yeah. Software-wise, has not been developed fully. So I think it was brought to market prematurely. A lot of the features needed more testing and more validation in terms of how they interoperability with other parts of the car. I no longer have access to the app. Certain features like unlocking the car from the app I don't have. I only have one key fob. So if I lose that key fob, I'm stuffed. There's some quirks with the car, like now recently the air conditioning system knocks. It does a strange thing before the car is ready to take off, and it takes a long time for things to, the infotainment system, for instance, it takes a long time for that to boot up when it should be instant.
And obviously now this company's filed for Chapter 11.
Or Chapter 7.
Or Chapter 7. Let's not get into the technicalities. But basically, they've gone bankrupt.
Yeah.
So there's no one working for them anymore, or a skeleton crew.
Yeah, they've probably got a skeleton crew working for them at the moment. There have been recalls on the car. There's something to do with the cooling system, which would render the car to lose its power. So there's got to be a recall on all the Fisker Oceans that are out there. I haven't received a letter to say, can you bring your car into XYZ, because I don't know how they're going to do it if they haven't got service centres to actually do the actual work.
So what now? Are you drivers going to get together? Have you got advice, legal advice now? Now, what are your next steps now in trying to either get your money back or to see if someone else is taking over the upgrades of the car?
I am exploring my options with other drivers. And in actual fact, another Fisker Ocean owner came and knocked on my window the other day while I was parked up and says, he's got a Fisker Ocean, he doesn't know what he's going to do. But we've all agreed that it makes sense to join the Fisker Owners Association. It's called FOA. They're based in the States, but they have a global reach, so that all Fisker owners that have the car can sort of band together and to keep the car on the road and also get compensation for some of the things that they've experienced as well as share tips and hints of any issues that you have and how to resolve them.
Oh dear. That London-based car owner of Fisker car, who's having a few problems, to say the least. By the way, we have contacted Fisker. We've tried to anyway, and not heard back. So I suspect, Pete, our message just probably ended up in some black hole somewhere, accompanied by endless messages from very disgruntled drivers saying that their windows don't work properly anymore and the entertainment system just has a mind of its own. What a nightmare. What did you think listening to that, apart from, thank God I didn't buy one of them?
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
But I think it speaks to your experience with the bike as well, though, that there's a big question here, like who actually owns the stuff that you've bought, right? So this is obviously an example of where the service centres have been set up for a company in the assumption that they'll last forever and no one else is going to be able to fix this. This isn't a classic car in the sense that it's all just mechanical. But this isn't just happening in electric vehicles. There was a company called Van Moof, which was an e-bike company, which went bankrupt last year, and they've actually, I think just started to relaunch. But there was a year in which anyone who'd bought one of these very swanky, very expensive e-bikes wasn't sure they were actually going to get them fixed, because you could only get them fixed at the service centres. No one else could do it. The app was suddenly not being updated, and you weren't clear if you could even use your bike, because you could lock your bike, you could access all the different services on it, and so almost like have we figured out how to deal with, first of all, who owns the hardware you've acquired, and secondly, is there kind of an end of life plan for this? If the company doesn't survive, how do you make sure that the thing will?
Yeah, indeed. And there's it's quite well known example of the John Deere tractors, and I think other tractor manufacturers. But and just for people who don't know that story, you have farmers who might have an issue with one of their John Deere tractors and are unable to get into the software or whatever to sort their tractor out, so that it has to be, and often quite expensively dealt with. By the way, we haven't spoken to John Deere about this item. We don't have a right of reply from them. They're very welcome to send us one if they want. But anyway, it's it's in the public domain that there have been these kinds of issues with ownership or questions over who owns what and what can an owner do with a piece of technology. And John Deere's come up in that discussion a lot as well. So
this whole idea of effectively subscribing to your tractor, which
yes,
which is a model that's kind of common. But I think even beyond just vehicles we're talking about, this is a problem for the Internet of Things in general. Like the Internet of Things means that your fridge is connected to the Internet and run by an app. Your wearable tech is connected to an app. But, I've thought about the various different types of wearable health monitors you've got, and all of them require a subscription. What happens if that? There are even Internet of Things medical devices now. You can get pacemakers attached, which are run through the Internet and by software that is owned by a company. What happens when that stops working?
Yeah, actually, I seem to remember back in our dim and distant past, back in the Digital Planet days at the BBC, and producer Anya is nodding through the glass there, of issues with that very thing, sort of implantable medical devices where they've become obsolete or for whatever reason they're not being supported anymore, and people have these things and they're wearing them, and maybe in some ways their life kind of depends on them. So what an issue that is. So I've learned many things from this program, including that in certain cars you can have California mode. Didn't you just love that? How aspirational is that? You can put the car into California mode. As a good boy from Mid Wales, I was thinking they used to have a Mid Wales mode where the windows automatically come up and the wipers start as soon as you go across the border, because basically it will rain. There we are. Thank you, Pete, for that. Now, let's hear about the Braille-tip, this device. Now, it's a pen that can translate Braille into text. Now, it's just a prototype at the moment, so I think it's fair to assume that once you have that Braille in text form, of course, it can be translated into audio or into other very useful means. So in this case, the user just runs the pen over those dimpled characters on a page of Braille, and the pen will then read out the words and sentences in real time. The plan is to improve literacy among visually impaired people. Dr George Jenkinson is a Bristol-based robotics researcher, and he's been leading the research on this. And in fact, you may just remember George if you're a frequent flyer on this podcast. In fact, he was on our very first edition of Somewhere on Earth. And back then, this is back in October, he was talking about a tactile sensor for examining the breast for diagnosing lumps and possible cancers. So this whole field of soft sensors, well, that's very much George's thing.
The area that I work in or have been working in is soft tactile robotics. So it's soft in the sense that it's physically soft. So the tip of this tactile sensor is made of silicone rubber. So that's, soft, squishy rubber that's soft to the touch. And the way that this sensor works on a kind of fundamental level is that there are areas within that rubber that are filled with liquid. And as the liquid area comes into contact with something, the rubber compresses and the liquid behind it moves. And we can film that using a camera. I have explored other means of sensing, but the most basic form and most successful and easy to implement way that I've been doing it is by using a camera to watch how this liquid moves. And then using computer vision algorithms, we can work backwards and say, okay, if this liquid here is moving, then that means that this particular area on this soft rubber membrane must be being touched right now. So we can basically, what I've done with this piece of work is miniaturize that so that the areas that the movement in the liquid corresponds to is actually a little bit smaller than a Braille bump, so that when we pass this over some Braille text, we can see with quite good resolution where the bumps on the paper or cardboard or perhaps metal or wherever the Braille is embossed, where those bumps actually are.
Right. Okay. So and then you can calibrate it all up, and so the tip goes over a bump, then the liquid, the fluid changes, the camera picks that up. So in other words, it's a bump or no bump detector, I suppose, is what you've made, albeit on a very small and very sensitive scale. And I guess the other part of that is that the tip needs to know where it is. It needs to understand that, for instance, the user has traced from left to right as it kind of progresses through the Braille.
Yeah. This is something that at the moment is a kind of assumption on the way that it's operated. So to make all this data, essentially I've done a proof of concept. So when I was gathering all this data and testing the pen, I was making sure that it traveled in one direction from left to right, and I was just trying to apply a reasonably constant amount of force. And this might sound a little bit removed from usual lab conditions where everything is incredibly precisely controlled in terms of, particularly in robotics, we tend to use very precise forces and very precise trajectories. But I wanted to get something that would reflect the real world use of this device. So I deliberately kind of tried to use it well, but I deliberately operated it by hand so that any errors or any shortcomings of the design in a realistic scenario were actually obvious in the results.
And how well does it work then? Can you give me an idea of, just what happens when people use it?
Yeah, so when I was using it, I got something like I think it was an 86% success rate in terms of identifying characters. And when I examined where it went wrong, it tended to not be wrong by very much. So just as a very brief crash course in Braille for, I'm assuming probably most listeners who won't perhaps know how to read or indeed write Braille, is that there's a 2x3 grid, so 2 columns, 3 rows of sites where there's potentially a raised bump. So if you imagine it's like essentially like a number 6 on a dice, where there's 6 dots. That's kind of like all of the dots are raised, and now you can lower or raise any of those dots, and the particular combination in which you do that correlates to a different letter. So where this Braille-tip went wrong, it tended to only be wrong by 1 or 2 bumps. So let's say there's a character that's made up of 5 raised bumps or 4 raised bumps. Braille-tip tended to get 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 5 of them right, and it either missed one or it put one in a slightly wrong location. So I'm quite happy that with a few kind of technical improvements, we'll get a higher accuracy rate. Ideally, you'd get as close to 100% as possible.
How significant do you think this is? So how is this going to help people who use Braille?
Target audience for this is actually people who want to use Braille but can't learn for whatever reason. So there's something that's very widely reported, kind of anecdotally, because I think it's on one hand difficult to study and on one hand slightly under studied, is that Braille literacy is in decline. And like one reason for that, you might think, oh well, audiobooks and audio description and other digital solutions now are very good, which is I'm sure that's part of the reason why fewer people are electing to learn Braille. But in studies of participatory studies, people who are visually impaired or blind and can read Braille often say that this is one of their most valued skills. They love being able to read Braille. So, and at the same time, there are lots of people who say they'd like to read Braille, or in fact have tried to learn how to read Braille, but they can't find a teacher or they can't find independent learning resources that would help them with this kind of skill acquisition. And we're trying to provide a tool that can help with this independent skill acquisition. So if someone's feeling a particular Braille sentence, traditionally, kind of at the moment, there's no real, they'd have to wait until someone who can read Braille or perhaps someone who can convert between Braille and written text to kind of help them with that. Whereas this pen bridges that gap, and it means that people are able to, or this pen in an ideal form, what I'm imagining it will be in the near future, bridges that gap and helps people to be able to learn how to read Braille independently. So ideally, it's a stepping stone. Eventually, you'd have it for a matter of months while you're learning, and once you've learned, of course, you don't really need it anymore.
Where do you hope to go next with this product? Will you try marketing it?
Yeah, so I think there are some clear improvements to be made. It'd be nice to have, so for example, one of the advantages of this is that it's very low power, and at the moment it uses a camera, which is really nice in terms of the fact that they're really cheap. And, I think because of things like smartphones, they're getting smaller and cheaper and better. But one downside is that with a camera, you kind of have to have a focal length. So that's kind of like the minimum size that you can make the sensor is actually reasonably big. So I want to move away from using a camera so that we can miniaturize this more and make it really, truly the size of a pen so that you can carry it around in your pocket. So there are a few other technical things I want to improve as well. So I think for the kind of next step, near future, looking to improve these two factors. And from there, hopefully we can make a viable product that people will want to use.
All right, there you go. So that's George Jenkinson telling us about that Braille pen. And listening to that was Pete Guest. What do you reckon then, Pete?
Well, the first thing I thought, which was perhaps slightly off topic, which is just how amazing a technology Braille is. And I looked it up earlier just to make sure I knew what I was talking about. And depending on when you decide it was invented, it's probably 200 years old this year.
Wow. I didn't realise it was that old. I'd have thought, it's Victorian, probably. Okay. Yeah. So that's one thing that strikes you about it then?
No, so yeah, absolutely. So I think it's definitely fascinating. And I think, as you mentioned there's this assumption that new technologies, particularly where you're talking about artificial intelligence, character recognition, audio readers and so on, are going to supersede these old technologies. But we've just had a 10-minute discussion about what the dangers are in relying on other people's platforms, and actually something I've come across a few times in my career is stories of people who find themselves left behind when technology moves on. And actually, Braille is a really good example of this. I was working on a story a couple of years ago with some amazing journalists in South Korea who were trying to get those big South Korean technology companies that produce fridges and cookers and televisions and entry pads for houses to stop making them touchscreens.
Right.
Because, of course, if you're visually impaired, you may struggle to use a touchscreen. But, of course, they look great and they move forward and it's all, but actually it leaves people behind. And so sometimes the actual kind of, the old technology was working perfectly well for accessibility, but we just need to find new ways to kind of integrate it into the way we work.
And just making sure the right people are in the room, or a diverse group of people in the room when people are coming up with new products. Yeah, and just one I'll throw in as well, listening to this, on the technology and the engineering side, because my background is in electronics, and when Anya said we were first going to be doing this story about a little tip that can run across some Braille and translate it into text and other data forms. And, of course, my engineering brain immediately thought, well, how would I design something like that? And I really struggled with it because I was thinking, well, would you have like a little piezoelectric tip or something? So this is a material whose that effectively generates like a little voltage every time it's in contact with something. And you can use the technology in microphones, for instance. And I was thinking, well, that it probably wouldn't have the sensitivity you need for Braille. And so then I was thinking, well, could you use a camera, but literally just on the Braille surface, but then you just wouldn't have the contrast. So I thought, well, maybe you'd have to light the Braille in some way so it has a bit of a relief to it, as it were. You light it from the side and then you get some contrast, but then that would make it very cumbersome to use. And then, of course, when we got into the interview with George, and he talked about this tip that has some fluid in it that moves, and then that's the thing that a camera then does go on to detect. And by the way, the cameras are cheap and ubiquitous. I was thinking, that's why he's doing this, and I'm just sitting here talking about it. But it's a nice, elegant solution.
It is, but it's also fascinating to see the amount of engineering you have to think of to replicate something which is a perfectly natural movement.
Yeah.
And this is the glory of the soft sensors, that you can replicate something which the extraordinary sensitivity of the human skin and the fingertips and so on, which otherwise would require vast amounts of engineering.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you very much indeed for that. That's Pete Guest you've been hearing from today, and me, Gareth Mitchell. It's been a while since I've given you a shout out for the old socials, so here they come. If you can email a social media, maybe it's an anti-social media because it's just you and me on the old email. Either way, it's hello@somewhereonearth.co. That's hello@somewhereonearth.co. On WhatsApp, we're code 44 for the UK, 7486 329 484. And everywhere else, most social media were pretty easy to find. Just look for Somewhere on Earth or SOEP or SOAP Tech or something like that. So we have sound today by Dylan and Keziah. The production manager is Liz. The producer and editor is Anya. And, well, I've already introduced Pete and I. We're at Lanson's Team Varna, and we're signing off for now. See you soon. Bye-bye.